There is a certain kind of night in tennis where you can feel the sport shifting under your feet. And Saturday night in Toronto was exactly that kind of night. Because somewhere between the second and third set of a match, nobody outside hardcore tennis circles was talking about a week ago. A 21-year-old from the Philippines quietly rewrote what people believed was possible for her. And by the time the last ball landed, she had done something that will be replayed on highlight reels for years. She had taken down Caty McNally, a fighter who had just knocked out a Wimbledon champion days earlier. And she had done it the hard way. 3 sets. A match that slipped away from her in the middle before she found her nerve again and closed it out 6-3. 5-7, 6-4. And if you think that sounds like just another line in a draw sheet, you are missing the story, because this was not some routine progression for Alex. This was a young woman standing in a sold-out stadium full of people waving Philippine flags, absorbing the weight of an entire nation's hope, and delivering anyway. And that is the kind of moment careers get built on. So let's talk about how we got here. Because the road to this Saturday night did not start this week. It started months ago with a shoulder injury and a first-round exit that could have derailed anyone. And instead, Alex turned it into fuel. And if you have been paying even a little attention to women's tennis this summer, you already know the name that keeps following her around, Maria Sharapova. And no, this is not some manufactured headline about a legend randomly weighing in on a random match. This is something deeper, and it is worth understanding properly before we get carried away. Because Alex has talked openly, on the record, about growing up watching Sharapova, about pulling grit and power from her game, about the kind of admiration that shapes a young athlete before she even fully understands what she is chasing. And when Sharapova later turned around and called Alex a star after she knocked out a defending Wimbledon champion, that was not a stranger complimenting a stranger. That was something closer to a mentor recognizing a piece of herself in someone new. And that is the emotional thread running underneath everything happening in Toronto right now. So let's rewind a little further, because to understand why this McNally win matters so much, you need to understand what Alex was carrying into this tournament. Just 1 week before Toronto, she was standing on a court in Washington, D.C., in a final nobody expected her to reach, let alone win, facing Jessica Pegula, a former world number 3, a player with the kind of resume that makes 21-year-olds nervous just reading it. And Alex lost the first set. And if you have ever watched a young player lose an opening set on a big stage, you know how easily that can spiral. Doubt creeps in. Legs get heavy. The crowd noise starts to feel like pressure instead of support. But instead of spiraling, Alex flipped the match on its head. She took the second set. And then she absolutely ran away with the third, 6-0. And when the last point landed, she had done something no Filipino player, man or woman, had ever done before. She had won a WTA singles title, and not just any title, a title earned by beating a top-tier opponent in a final that tested every part of her game and every part of her composure. And that is the kind of achievement that changes how an entire country watches a sport. Because tennis has never been a mainstream pursuit in the Philippines the way basketball is, the infrastructure has never been there the way it has in bigger tennis nations. And yet, here was a 21-year-old proving that none of that mattered as much as everyone assumed it did. So when Alex arrived in Toronto just days later, still riding that high, nobody quite knew what to expect. Would the emotional and physical toll of Washington catch up with her? Would the pressure of instantly being the story of the tournament weigh her down? And her first answer came against Alicia Parks. Another American, another 3-set battle, 6-1, 4-6, 6-2. A match where Alex again showed that thing that separates good players from great ones. The ability to absorb a bad set without losing the thread of the match. And then came McNally. And this is where the story gets its real texture. Because McNally was not just some name plucked out of the draw. McNally arrived in Toronto having just pulled off one of the biggest upsets of the tournament, eliminating Linda Noskova, the reigning Wimbledon champion, in straight sets, So this was not Alex facing a lesser opponent riding a lucky draw. This was Alex facing someone with real form, real confidence, and a game built specifically to disrupt exactly the kind of baseline rhythm Alex likes to play. McNally mixes pace. She comes to net. She tries to take rhythm away from you before you ever find it. And for a set and a half, it worked. McNally took that second set, and if you were watching live, there was a moment where you could feel the crowd tighten up, because everyone in that stadium understood what was on the line. Not just a spot in the next round, but the continuation of a story that the entire Filipino tennis community had been holding its breath over since Washington. And this is the part that I think gets lost when people just read a scoreline. The emotional stakes in that stadium were enormous. Families had traveled, flags were out, phones were up. An entire diaspora was watching through screens back home in Manila and Cebu and Davao, at hours that meant staying up late or waking up early just to catch a live stream. And Alex had to go out and be the calm one in the middle of all of that noise. And she did. She reset after that second set. She found her serve again. She started dictating points instead of reacting to them. And she closed out that third set 6-4 to book her spot in the round of 16 against Belinda Bencic, a former champion of this exact tournament. And look, I want to be honest with you here, because this channel is not in the business of manufacturing drama that does not exist. There is no verified moment this week of Sharapova specifically reacting live to the McNally match. I am not going to sit here and tell you she tweeted something about this specific result, because that is not something I can confirm. But here is what I can tell you, and it is arguably more meaningful than a single reaction tweet would be anyway. The relationship between these two already exists. It is documented, it is real, and it did not appear out of nowhere this week. Alex has spoken in press conferences about idolizing Sharapova as a kid, about the grit she borrowed from watching her matches. And when Alex beat the defending Wimbledon champion Iga Swiatek earlier this year in one of the most stunning results of her career, it was Sharapova who publicly called her a star, in her own words, unprompted. The kind of endorsement that does not get handed out casually by someone who has actually stood at the very top of this sport. 5 Grand Slam titles, a former world #1, someone who knows better than almost anyone alive what it feels like to be a young outsider trying to break into a sport that was not built with you in mind. Because remember, Sharapova herself came up as a Russian teenager navigating a tour dominated by different accents, different backgrounds, different assumptions about who belongs at the top. And when she looks at Alex, a left-handed Filipina working her way up through a country with almost no tennis infrastructure to speak of, it is not hard to understand why she sees something familiar there. So even without a fresh headline this week, the foundation of that mentorship, that recognition, that quiet passing of respect from one generation to the next, is already built into the story of what is happening to Alex right now. And honestly, I think that context matters more than any single tweet ever could, because it tells you this is not a manufactured narrative. This is a real thread that has been building for months, long before this Toronto run even started. So let's talk about what actually changed in Alex's game this year. Because the wins are one thing, but the how is really where the story lives. If you go back and watch her matches from a year or two ago compared to now, the difference is not subtle. Her serve has more variety. She is not just relying on pace, she is placing it to open up the court before the point even really begins. Her return game has become noticeably more aggressive. Instead of just getting the ball back in play against big servers, she is stepping in and taking time away from opponents, and, maybe most importantly, her composure under pressure has completely transformed. The version of Alex who might have crumbled after losing that second set to McNally would have looked very different a couple of years ago. This version steadied herself, trusted her legs, trusted her hands, and closed the door. And that kind of mental toughness does not show up overnight. It gets built match by match, disappointment by disappointment. And clearly, something clicked for her this summer because the results are speaking for themselves. A maiden WTA title in Washington, back-to-back three-set battles in Toronto against quality American opponents, and now a date with Belinda Bencic, a former champion of this very event, someone who knows exactly what it takes to go deep in a WTA 1000 tournament. So the question everyone is asking now, and honestly, it is the only question that matters at this point, is how far can this run go? Can Alex carry the physical and emotional weight of back-to-back deep tournament runs without it catching up to her? Because tennis has a brutal way of humbling players who ride too high too fast. The body only has so much in the tank, and 2 weeks of high-intensity three-set matches is a real physical toll. But there is also something to be said for momentum, for the psychological freedom that comes from proving to yourself that you belong on these courts against these opponents. And Alex has now proven that twice in the span of a week. First against a former top 3 player in a final, and now against a player who had just taken down a Grand Slam champion. So if you are wondering whether this is a fluke, a hot streak that is about to run cold, I would gently push back on that idea. Because flukes do not usually come with this kind of pattern, one big scalp is a surprise. 2 in a row starts to look like a trend. And if she finds a way past Bencic, that trend starts to look a lot like a genuine changing of the guard. And here is where I think the Sharapova connection actually deepens rather than fades. Because legends do not typically stay quiet about players they have already publicly praised. If Alex keeps winning, if this run extends into the second week of this tournament, do not be surprised if we hear from Sharapova again. And if we do, you will understand exactly why it matters. Because this is not a case of a retired champion randomly picking a favorite to promote. This is someone who has watched this specific player's journey unfold in real time, who has already put her name behind her once, and who clearly sees in Alex the kind of grit and hunger that defined her own career. And for Filipino fans, I think it is worth sitting with what this moment actually represents beyond the scoreboard. Because tennis in the Philippines has never had a figure like this. Basketball has always been the sport that captured the national imagination, and tennis has largely existed on the margins. A handful of dedicated academies, limited access to quality coaching, almost no pathway for a young player to break into the international tour without significant sacrifice from her family. And Alex's story is a direct product of exactly that kind of sacrifice. Her family made choices most people never have to make, uprooting parts of their life, investing in training abroad, betting on a dream that had very little historical precedent to point to. And now here she is, a WTA titleist, a player capable of beating Grand Slam champions, a player who has earned the public respect of one of the greatest to ever play the sport. And every time she walks onto a court now, she is not just playing for a ranking point or a paycheck. She is playing in front of a country that is watching her build something that simply did not exist before her. A real pathway, a real proof of concept. And that is why the emotional reaction to her wins feels so much bigger than a typical third-round match at a WTA 1000 event. Because for a lot of young players and their families back home, Alex is not just a tennis player anymore. She is evidence. Evidence that talent from a country without deep tennis infrastructure can still climb all the way to the top of the sport. Evidence that the traditional map of where great tennis players come from is not fixed. It is expanding, and every match she wins adds another data point to that argument. And I think that is exactly why moments like Sharapova's public praise carry so much extra weight for this specific athlete. It is not just validation from a legend. It is validation from someone who represents exactly the kind of outsider success story that Alex is trying to become herself. And when that kind of recognition happens, it does not just boost one player's confidence. It sends a signal to every young athlete watching from thousands of miles away that the door is not closed. That excellence really can come from anywhere if you are willing to put in the work. So where does this go from here? Honestly, nobody can say for certain. Bencic is a serious test. a former champion of this exact event, someone who has been through the wars of the tour for years and knows how to slow down a player who wants to play fast. But if Alex has shown us anything over the last 2 weeks, it is that she is no longer intimidated by big names or big occasions. She has already beaten a top 3 ranked player in a final. She has already beaten a player fresh off, eliminating a Wimbledon champion. The stage does not seem to be getting to her anymore. If anything, it seems to be bringing something out of her. And that is usually the sign of a player who is genuinely arriving rather than just having one good week. So keep an eye on this one, because whether or not Bencic ends this run in the next round, something has clearly shifted for Alex this summer. She has gone from a promising young talent people were cautiously optimistic about to a legitimate threat that seeded players now have to actually game plan around. And that shift, from surprise to expectation, is one of the most important transitions in any athlete's career. It is the difference between being a nice story and being a genuine contender. And if the last 2 weeks are any indication, Alex is firmly in that second category now, so that is where things stand heading into the next round in Toronto. A young Filipina fresh off the biggest title of her career, carrying the hopes of a nation that has never had a tennis star quite like her. With one of the greatest players in the history of the sport already on record calling her a star in her own right, what happens next is genuinely uncertain. But the trajectory speaks for itself. And if you have been following this story, you already know this is only going to get more interesting from here. So let me know in the comments what you think happens against Bencic. Do you think Alex has the legs and the composure to keep this run going? And do you think we will hear from Sharapova again if she does? Drop your predictions below. And if you want more coverage of Alex's run through the rest of this tournament, stick around, because this story is far from over.